Okay, this video is going to be called Dave Schultz Incrementalism Against Cancer. So what it is an idea of how to help yourself decrease your risk of cancer and hopefully live longer, okay, if you got cancer, a way to fight the cancer. Other titles for this potentially could be God's Way of Healing, Fabian Scorched Earth, Poor Man's Strategy. And, what does it come down to? It comes down to this. Everybody's got problems, and we're talking in particular about health problems here, like if you've got cancer, what are the things you could do to help yourself in addition to whatever else you're doing? And the question one asks is, how do you win when you don't have any money? How do you win when you don't have much talent? And here's the secret. A willingness to learn and put the effort into learning and then using what you learn, that's actually a great talent. Learning a bunch of small skills, which each seem insignificant by themselves, added up together, that's a great talent. They become something powerful. And where I learned this is from these two guys. This is Dave Schultz and Mark Schultz. They're both NCAA world and Olympic champion wrestlers. Okay, they were my coaches at Stanford. This is Stanford University. That's the Hoover Institution. Those are the famous sandstone buildings with the red roofs of Stanford University. They're on one of the Palo Alto Bay Hills where we used to run sprints as a wrestling team training. So that's where I first met these guys, my freshman year at Stanford. That's why I went to Stanford, to be coached by them. And we'd run sprints up these hills, and this was Dave. I noticed at the time he was kind of fat. He was a little bit out of shape at the time, and he was slow at running. And I'm like, and we went in the weight room and lifted. He was weak, and I'm like, how did a guy who was fat, weak, and slow become NCAA champion? His brother Mark was stronger, and he was a faster runner. What I mostly learned from him was especially mental toughness, a psychological approach to wrestling and to life. And they both were very, very helpful to me. So I'm going to explain how this helps you to get better results in other things you want to do, with the emphasis on fighting cancer, a poor man's strategy, God's way of healing. All right. So first of all, here's Dave Schultz representing the United States. Again, he won world and Olympic champions. And look at him, he's got this fat on his belly. He was fatter at the time in Stanford, but I'm just saying he don't look like the typical national champion, world champion wrestler. They're usually muscle bound with muscles on top of their muscles. Okay. Here he is winning the Olympics against Nasp, the German. And this is Dave Schultz in on a single leg. And he had fantastic technique. He had the best technique of any wrestler in the entire world. He was like what Bruce Lee is to martial arts. That's what he was to wrestling. Okay, so now what I'm going to talk about too is a little bit about famous comebacks where it looked like defeat was inevitable, but victory was restored. And so we're gonna talk about this, like, how do you fight cancer when you really don't have a lot of resources? And this is what I'm trying to help you with. Okay, so this was Hannibal, the great general of Cartilage, and he kicked the crap out of the Romans. He killed many tens of thousands of them. This here is a jar, an urn full of rings that they took from the dead Roman soldiers, and he had a lot of them. Okay, so this is a statue of Hannibal counting the rings. And the Romans were very afraid. It looked inevitable that he was going to crush Rome. Okay, that Carthage was going to become the big empire. The Romans got this guy, Fabius, Quintus Fabius Maximus. He said he had a strategy. So they made him, the general counsel in charge of the Roman army, and he figured out a strategy to fight Rome. To fight Carthage, Hannibal. Hannibal was far from home, far from Carthage. So what he recognized was maybe if he could just cut off the supply lines for Hannibal, that would be enough. So instead of getting into a big open battle where Hannibal just crushed everyone, he decided to just, try to take out the supply lines of Hannibal and avoid any big battle. And it worked. He was able to drive Hannibal out of Rome, and the Romans ended up being victorious. Okay, so this is called the Fabian strategy. That's an important word to know, the Fabian strategy. And it's sort of a variation on scorched earth strategy. Okay, scorched earth strategy more comes to mind when we talk about Napoleon. So Napoleon was, just like Hannibal, one of the greatest military minds of all time, generals of all time. And Napoleon from France was just kicking everybody's butt in Europe. He was basically taking over all of Europe. He had taken over Germany, Austria, and he decided he'd taken over Spain, Italy. He decided he was going to take over Russia. This is one painting of Napoleon victorious, crossing over the Alps. So Napoleon, was a badass, okay, and everyone was scared of him. When he went into Russia, what the Russians did was they just applied a scorched earth policy. Russians like this giant continent. It's so massive that they would have to retreat and they would lose little battle after little battle. But Napoleon always said an army travels on its stomach. And so he would just take whatever food was from the land side, from the local farmers and peasants, whoever was around him, and just take all their food. But what the Russians did is they burned the crop fields. They made sure there was nothing. There was nothing for Napoleon and his soldiers to take. And Napoleon, he came in, I don't know, with over like 500,000 men. He ended up having only about 15,000 as he retreated back to France. They were starving and dying. Okay, so again, that's a variation on the Fabian strategy, and it worked against Napoleon. So cancer kind of comes in like a badass, it's going to kill you, and everyone's like, oh, it's so sad, take your chemo and hope for the best. And there's actually a lot more you could do. We're going to go about things from a metabolic strategy of cancer, not this somatic mutation theory, the SMT. We're going to go over the MTC, the metabolic theory of cancer, that's MTC. And we're going to explain how that helps you to do a lot of things that can really make a big difference. So cancer, first step is know your enemy, okay? Your enemy is cancer. First of all, there's damage to DNA. There's not much you can do about that. We've all had some damage to our DNA at some time in the past. All right, it could have happened when you were a teenager, when you're a kid. There's nothing you can do about that. And there's a mutation mechanism, there's a hypoxia mechanism, the Warburg theory, that when deprived of oxygen, a cell can revert to anaerobic metabolism, become like an anaerobic bacteria. A lot of them die from apoptosis due to hypoxia, lack of oxygen. So we're going to want to maintain good oxygen to our cells. That's going to be a useful strategy, but that's the initiation phase of cancer. Next phase of cancer is tumor promotion, and this is really where the battle is fought. You want to stop the tumor from growing. You also want to help prevent the spread of metastases. So you want to have a good immune system. It is your immune system which fights metastases, okay? Then you want to do everything you can to avoid activating mTOR. mTOR is the growth pathway, mammalian target of rapamycin, and it tells us, grow, replicate, divide. So you want to not give it what it needs. You want to avoid all these estrogenic chemicals, especially if you have a hormonally sensitive cancer like a prostate cancer, breast cancer. No animal protein. It's a major tumor promoter. We'll explain why. Avoid high-fat food because that tends to activate mTOR. All right, let's see what else is up here. Avoid hypoxia because that can favor cancer. That creates a cancer-favorable milieu as hypoxic and acidotic. So you want to avoid things that cause acidosis, which again is especially animal protein, but also high amounts of sodium chloride. The chloride will displace bicarbonate in the blood, and that'll cause a low-grade metabolic acidosis. I'm going to go through like a model of cancer. You want to understand the model of cancer, sort of how it works. So what is this? Cancer cell must double itself to reproduce. That means it has to double its amount of proteins, double its amount of nucleic acid, double its amount of carbohydrates and lipids in order to grow. So it needs to do synthesis. And the point is, a normal cell doesn't need to make that much stuff most of the time. Most of them, they're focused on doing work. A normal cell is like a worker in your body. So its goal is to make tons of ATP, tons of energy for the purpose of doing work, whatever that might be. Let's say you're a liver cell. You got to detoxify a lot of stuff. You got to make the bile. You got to manage the blood glucose level. That's your job. All right, but if you're a cancer cell says, take this job and shove it. I don't have enough energy because I'm running primarily on glycolysis, anaerobic metabolism. I just want to go find a new place to live. Go find a new apartment somewhere. I'm on my own. Screw you guys. So what cancer wants to do is just make as many copies of itself as it can, and hopefully one of them will find a good apartment. It just wants to grow, again, like an anaerobic bacteria. So this is the model of cancer that you need to understand. I'm going to go into a little more detail about how this works. By the way, as far as making a model of something, it has been said that scientists and doctors love their models just as much as artists do, perhaps more. This, of course, is the famous painting of Pygmalion and Galatea when he made the statue and he fell in love with her and she came to life. A little bit like the nutrition and weight loss expert. Imagine that he'll take a fat lady and help her lose weight. And I'm not even going to go any more of that, but that's kind of funny. Okay. Anyways, this is now cancer cell metabolism. So here's an anaerobic bacteria running on anaerobic glycolysis to metabolize glucose to pyruvate. It makes very small amounts of ATP. Only 2 ATP per glycolysis, expels a waste product, a lactate. Okay? Normal human cell primarily runs on oxygen, aerobic metabolism, and it runs everything through the mitochondria, and it can make like 36 ATPs per molecule of glucose. So that's a lot more, 18 times more than just making 2 ATPs from glucose over here. Okay, so that's oxidative metabolism as opposed to anaerobic metabolism. All right, also called aerobic metabolism. Okay, so now here is the cancer cell. So this one is much more like this anaerobic bacteria. It's running primarily on anaerobic glycolysis. In order to replicate itself, it needs lots of fat, taking it up through the CD36 receptor. It needs lots of iron. It'll have hundreds, maybe 1,000 times more iron receptors for transferring the iron blood transport protein than a regular cell. So you want to restrict iron. That's an important point. You want to restrict iron, minimize iron in your diet. You want to get your serum ferritin level down. If I had cancer, I want my serum ferritin level probably between 25 and 50. Definitely below 100. Certainly below 80, but to really push it to the max, I'd want to be like between 25 to 50. Okay, and that's based on the Leo-Zacharski data. All right, what else does the cancer cell do? It pumps out lactic acid, protons into its extracellular matrix, so it has a very anaerobic, acidic milieu. That means the tissue around it, its extracellular matrix space. And again, glutamine can come in the back door. So don't give me any of this keto diet stuff. I think that's BS. I think that you could hide glucose from the body. It doesn't matter. You need glucose for your brain anyways. Plus, if you come in the back door with glutamine, that's the most abundant amino acid, you're not going to be able to win the game with keto. Okay, so a lot of people think that that's how you win the game. No, it's not. All right. Okay, and so what's about sort of the big picture view here is that your body can either be in a maintenance phase or it can be in a growth phase, and you want to stay in the maintenance phase. So the maintenance phase, what the growth phase means is food is abundant, resources are abundant for growth and replication. So mTOR is activated. Mammalian targeted rapamycin is like a nutrient sensing pathway that basically, like a contractor getting ready to build a building, when it has enough resources, especially leucine, also it needs iron, methionine, fats, it'll say, go, replicate. Okay, so you want to deprive mTOR of what it wants. So it'll say, no, we can't replicate it. It'll have mTOR shut off. These are other things that sort of activate the growth pathway. You want to be in maintenance. So after you exercise, your body's tired. There's a depletion of energy. You're in a low resources moment, a low energy moment. So the body has to recreate its ATP supplies, adenosine triphosphate. That's what you want to spend your time in. You want to exercise every day. Eat a starch, plant-based diet. Fruits are really good as well. They're also quite alkaline. Veggies are good too. We're going to talk a lot about eating greens. All these other things are psychological things that help you. And by the way, I've given lots of lectures on cancer and stuff. So just a few more words on all this stuff. The next thing is you want to think biblical. Modern people have been brainwashed to be minimum wage losers, okay? You don't want to be like them. You don't want this everything in moderation. What are you going to do? Just go with the flow. I hope things work out. No. You say, thou shalt not eat meat. Thou shalt not eat oils. Thou shalt not eat alcohol. Thou shalt not smoke. Not a drop of anything bad for you. No caffeine. Get your sleep every day. We're going to talk about these things. Minimize your iron, because all these little things are going to add up, and you are capable of so much more than you think to fight against cancer and increase your odds of achieving anything. Real achievers, they're intense and focused. They're not these wimpy milquetoast, everything in moderation types. That doesn't lead to anything. If you want to really have a big achievement, focus, figure out what you want to do, and be intense about it. Okay, all the great people I've met are pretty intense. You have to be. You can be nice and kind and thoughtful, but internally you're intensely focused on what your goals are. Okay, so I just showed this. This is a burning of a boat because it reminds me of Hernan Cortez when he was in Mexico. Basically, all his Spanish conquistadors, you might call them, they wanted to turn back. They wanted to go back to Cuba where they had a nice, stable situation. He said, no, we're going through Mexico. And they conquered the Aztecs. Now, what he did was he burned the boats. He sank all the boats, and so they couldn't turn back. They had no other option. And what I'm trying to say is, when you have cancer, or when you are at a determination point in your life where you have to go for it, or it's your only chance, go for it 100%. And so that idea of burn the boats. So it was amazing that Cortez won. He had very few men in comparison with the Aztecs, but they still won. It's a whole long story. We're not going to go into it, but just the idea of burn the boats. That's over. This is it. Now. All right. So next one here is from the Rocky movie. Now, I love the Rocky movies. I love Sylvester Stallone. And this was his coach, Mick, Mickey, the Irish guy. Gotta like that. And basically, Rocky, when he first started out, he was sort of a so-so fighter in the fight business. And Mickey was trying to turn him around, and Rocky was a little lazy. And he said one time to Mick, Mick, I'm tired. why don't we just train tomorrow? And Mickey said, there is no tomorrow. You need to do this today. And that's the kind of energy generated by burn the boats, think biblically. This is my goal in life. This is my quest. This is my mission. This is the cross I must bear. This is what I must do. That type of thinking generates results. Okay, so that's how you want to think. You want to think like a winner, focused, intense. Okay, I'm going to tell you about some incredible cancer survivors here. This one is Ruth Heidrich, PhD, diagnosed with breast cancer when she's about 40 years of age. And she went and saw Dr. McDougall, went on the vegan diet. She said she became a vegan instantly, just from talking to him for a couple hours. He told her what to do and why. She says, I'm vegan. Because otherwise, they told her, she had metastatic breast cancer. They told her, you're dead within 6 months, make a will, there's nothing you could do. And she said, no, I want to run a marathon. And she became 100% vegan. She's now, it's like 30, almost 40 years later. She ended up winning a bunch of triathlons and marathons and setting world records and survived cancer for about 40 years. So that's an incredible story. And so there's some things to learn. She lives in Hawaii where it's nice and sunny, so she gets plenty of sun. There's reasons why getting sun is helpful. She also, is running on the sand, nice clean water by the water. There's lots of available fruits real easily when you live in a warm climate. Here's another lady with a similar story. This is Janet Murray Wakelin. She was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, and she's alive now about like 23 or something like that years later. She did an incredible thing. She runs, this is her husband, they like to run together. She ran in the perimeter, all around the outer circumference of Australia. Like 365 marathons. She ran like 26 miles a day. Incredible story, to raise awareness for, and she wrote a book called Raw Can Cure Cancer. 100% raw diet, lots of fruits and veggies, and some starches too, but, if it's raw, there's no starches. But anyways, I read her book. It was a very good book about her experience. So both of these ladies had breast cancer, and I know of other women who had breast cancer, and that's often the case. They live in a warm climate, they get a lot of sun, and they eat 100% plant-based, and psychologically they focus all their energy on getting better. Okay, so this is sort of a repeat of what we said, that exercise puts you in the AMP pathway. That's adenosine monophosphate, protein kinase pathway, and that's basically the opposite of mTOR. That is the restoration phase. After exercise, you have to recover. You got to get your sleep too, so you can keep recovering well. And that dramatically improves your immune system. And I briefly just mentioned my mother. My mother had cancer. They told her she's only going to live about 2-3 years at the most. And she ended up living for about 11, 12 years. And basically, I'm the one who screwed up because back then, that was many, many, many years ago. I didn't know. I first found out, when I was just a little medical student, and I just figured, send her to the specialist. I had no idea that I could learn cancer and all this other stuff and what to do, as a young guy. So I regret that. But anyways, she did a lot of things right. I think that's why she outlived her predicted survival. Instead of dying in 2 to 3 years, she lived, about 11 to 12 years. Okay, and that's how she did it. She exercised a lot, and she also did all the right stuff psychologically. Okay, some of the new stuff I'm going to talk about. You've heard a lot of my lectures probably if you're interested in cancer. Some big new things I'm talking about. One of them is this stuff from Caldwell Esselstyn. He, of course, wrote the magnificent book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. The guy deserves a Nobel Prize. It's a masterpiece. It's just magnificent what he did. All right. And here's some quotes from Caldwell Esselstyn. Nitric oxide is the most powerful vasodilator in the body. You want your arteries dilated because then you get more oxygen delivered to your tissues. That's how you have good tissue function. When you have good oxygen, you favor the normal tissues over the cancer. Cancer wants a hypoxic acidotic milieu. So you want to load it up with oxygen. Okay. Dr. Esselstyn continues, nitric oxide is the life jacket of your arteries. It's a vasodilator produced by the endothelium that dilates the arteries to get more oxygen in there. And it also prevents clotting as well. The number one goal of good arterial function is to maintain adequate amounts of nitric oxide. As we get older, our arteries produce less nitric oxide. But the body has another way to produce nitric oxide from plants. Okay, so this is a big thing. And this is new to Esselstyn. He just added this about 5 to 10 years. So basically in the past, people would think if you just kept your arteries healthy, you're going to be in good shape. And what he's saying is nitric oxide function goes down a lot, especially if you're a meat eater, smoker, and all that. And a vegan, it doesn't go down as bad, but it still does go down some. So he says there's other ways to get nitric oxide, and he emphasizes that we can produce nitric oxide from plants. If you eat green plants, most of them contain the precursors for production of nitric oxide. And he actually recommends a person eat steamed green veggies 6 times a day to keep their arteries bathed in nitric oxide all day long. And one of the points I'm going to make in this lecture is that sunshine also increases your nitric oxide, your systemic, that means throughout the entire body, arterial nitric oxide. So this is a big one. That was a big new point. That was an AO, by the way, meaning an academic orgasm. Okay, the plant's got nitrates. So you eat the plant and the nitrates. It goes into your mouth. There's bacteria that live on your tongue that convert the nitrates to NO2. All right, and the NO2 minus, like nitric dioxide, it gets then sent into your stomach, and the stomach acid facilitates the conversion of it to nitric oxide, NO. All right, and these are things that inhibit it. So you don't want mouthwash or this type of toothpaste. You don't want this in your water. You don't want to be taking antibiotics. Watch out for some of these meds like PPIs, antacids, okay? And also, once you're eating all this stuff, it's going to lower your blood pressure. So if you're on blood pressure pills, you're going to have to work that out with your doctor to titrate down your dosages, all right? But this nitric oxide is going to increase oxygenation in your tissues, and there's a good chance one can hope that increase in tissue oxygenation will create a milieu that favors the good cells and not the cancer cells, because that's what you want, to hyperoxygenate your tissues. Everything in the human body works better when it has good oxygen supply. Okay, another thing we're going to talk about is that the sun helps to make sulfate. A lot of people are sulfate deficient, and you need sulfate to maintain the lining of your arteries called the endothelial glycocalyx. So get your sunshine as best you can. If you live in a cold climate, just make sure you get as much of it as you can when you can, because that's going to produce multiple benefits. In addition, the sunshine produces increased nitric oxide, vasodilator for your arteries. So sun does a lot of stuff that's good for you beyond what you learned about vitamin D. Of course, it's good for vitamin D. Okay, I'm briefly going to go a little bit more through why did Dave and Mark Schultz have such a big influence on me, and how this relates to this whole theme of this talk and the psychology of it. Basically, you make yourself into a winner. These guys, their father had nothing to do with wrestling. A lot of guys are good at wrestling. Their fathers coached them since they were little kids, and they got all the best advantages for technique. The way it worked for Dave is when he was young, he was a fat kid with dyslexia, so other kids would, beat him up. His nickname was Pudge. They're like, hey, you fat, stupid idiot. You can't even read. You suck. Okay? And so he started wrestling, and he really liked it, and he saw that he was able to improve by learning technique, and he got better and better. When he was a kid, he'd ride his bike from, Palo Alto High School to Stanford University and train with the college guys, and by the time he was in junior high, and then when he's in high school, he is the best high school wrestler in the entire United States. He defeated Chuck Coagulation, threw him and pinned him in the finals of the Open Nationals when he was in high school. Okay, Chuck Coagulation was defending national champion from the University of Iowa. I think he was even MVP, and he beat Chuck Coagulation. Okay, that was an amazing thing. All right, Mark Schultz was a gymnast. He's a great gymnast. But he was a little jealous because the wrestlers look like they're having more fun than the gymnasts. And Dave used to always beat him up all the time. So come on, wrestle with me, you wimp, and kick the crap out of him. And so he learned to just stall against Dave till finally he got to the point where he could stop Dave from scoring. And then he could try to wear him down, get him tired. But that's a big thing to know, is when somebody can just kick your butt and you can't do much, it's good to stall. Learn how to stall. Learn how to defend him better. And he had a great psychology of wrestling. I had a bunch of injuries. I was a little frustrated. I'll show you some more pictures so it'll make more sense. Okay, here's Mark Schultz winning the NCAA championship against Ed Bannock. And, Ed Bannock everyone thought he was going to be a 4-time NCAA champion. He was a very dominant and intimidating guy. And Mark Schultz just kicked his butt. It's one of the greatest NCAA matches of all time. It was an awesome match. Okay, this is just joking around in the wrestling room. We had a mat down here for doing throws. You throw your opponent onto the big mat here. And then there's a chin-up bar over here. And Mark Schultz would jump down. It's just a plastic knife. And so he did that, though. What I'm trying to say is this is how we joked around, okay? The wrestlers, it was normal, and everybody liked the idea. A wrestler is kind of like a football player. They go fight, if you will, for the honor of their school. And in high school in the Midwest, the wrestlers and the football players, especially the football players, were kind of like local celebrities. And that was good. I liked that. Okay, I was a wrestler. But America's becoming progressively pussified, okay? So what I'm trying to say is this is how we joked around, this kind of stupid, crazy stuff. And it's just funny. It's a plastic knife. And, okay, we're just goofing around in practice. But what I'm trying to say is there's a mentality that came from it. All the wrestlers wanted to be good, too. We all wanted to get better. And so what I'm trying to say is that's important. Whereas in medicine, I'm not going to get into all the social stuff in medicine, but in medicine, it's about making money unfortunately, more than it is about figuring out what's best. So that's what I'm trying to do, is help you figure out what's best with all the stuff that doesn't make money, so you can do it on your own. And I also call that God's way of healing. I learned that from a Dr. Lorraine Day, because she talked about that, and you don't need any money for this stuff. This is all free. So here's just the context of the situation, all those years ago, back in the 1980s at Stanford. I just got recruited over there as an athlete because I'd been injured. So before that, I was pretty good, and I could have gone anywhere, Big Ten school and stuff. But Stanford still wanted me. I wanted to go to Stanford because I wanted to get trained by the Schultz brothers. I didn't know if I was going to overcome my injury problems. I had a problem. I fractured a growth plate on my shoulder, and I kept getting repeat injuries coming back too soon. But just to show you what a pathetic little freshman I was, I got this calendar on the wall because I'm just counting the days to go home. I was so lonely. I didn't know a single person over there. I missed my girlfriend. I wanted to go home, see her for Christmas, and then see her for the summer. And that's where I was at. And then here I am with this blanket on my lap, looked like Linus in the security blanket. But I just show you that. And the Schultz brothers, I was kind of scared of them. Here I am. I'm just a low-life little freshman. These guys are national champions. So I was even scared to talk to them, kind of. And then just another more perspective. Here's my training partner in high school, Johnny Jura. He was state champion. I had taken third as a junior, 39-1. It was my only loss the whole year. So I took third in state. I should have won state, but I screwed up. I took third. So, but I knew I had a lot of talent. I hadn't had any technique yet. I just did that all in physical ability. I knew once I had technique, I could be really good. Johnny Jura, he pinned his way through state his senior year. He was my training partner, and he went on to be 3-time All-American in college. And actually 4-time All-American, and he also was World Cup champion. He had a great wrestling career. And here's one of my roommates. He was national champion and All-American national champion. And so I was used to getting my ass kicked. I'm wrestling against Dave Schultz, the world champion, kicking my ass. These are posters in the dorm room of the fraternity room of Dave Schultz, world and Olympic champion, Mark Schultz, world and Olympic champion. And this was the wall of fame, I was in the newspaper a bunch of times. I was student athlete of the year. I was captain of the team eventually. Set the school record for most victories in a season and undefeated in dual meets one year. So anyways, I show you this stuff just because, but I was really low man on the totem pole in the wrestling world compared to all these guys. And that was relevant because it pissed me off. And I'm going to show you how that ended up helping me. Sometimes being really sad and frustrating can help, because I said, I can't be as great a wrestler as these guys, and I was very sad. I used to cry about that. I said, I'm going to become a great scholar. And I took this idea of Dave Schultz, how you learn everything about your field, and I put it into academics. And that's how I ended up student athlete here at Stanford, graduating first in my medical school class, having 99% board scores. And then same thing in med school and residency. Then I wrote a book about that too. So I sort of tried to become like what Dave and Mark Schultz were to wrestling. I tried to become that for academics. And I used their strategy as applied to academics. And the purpose of this lecture is how do you apply that same strategy to make yourself into something when you don't have a lot of resources. And we'll apply that to getting better from cancer. The other thing I wanted to mention was, first of all, here's my mom again. And this is the idea of joking around. People who joke around a lot, it actually makes them healthier. It lowers their stress levels. So anyway, my mom was always cracking jokes. Here she is goofing around with the goose. What the heck's she doing? All right. Here's just a funny picture. This is one Plato, the big sort of stuck-up pompous philosopher, was asked to define what is a man. And he said a man is a featherless biped. So then Diogenes, kind of the funny philosopher who lived in the street, he, as a joke, just plucked a chicken and said, here's Plato's idea of a man. But that type of clowning around just makes life a lot more fun for everybody. My mom was also quite religious. She went on a religious pilgrimage to Medjugorje, and I think that helped her. She was board of directors of an orphanage. She was minister of care. So she was doing all these nice things for people, adopted a couple girls. All these things, I think, psychologically kept her a lot healthier. Again, I'm the one who screwed up that I didn't know all this metabolic stuff back in those days. And also her home made her very happy. For any person, usually their family and a few close friends really bring a lot of happiness in life. So try to spend time with those people, because being happier and around people you like lowers your stress level, makes you happier, makes you more resilient. So this is a nice painting, Homecoming by Edward Moran. And for my mom, the family was sort of her life. She didn't have to work. My father supported the whole family financially, so she just went around doing whatever needed to be done. And the family was her main priority in life. And that was a good thing. We were all very lucky about that. Like, one of her grandchildren was born premature, so she's over there. She took care of this kid for about half a year or longer than that, till the kid was much more secure and everything was set with the mom. And Here's another one where one of her grandchildren was born in septic shock. It's a long story how that happened. I've talked about this in other lectures, but just to give you an idea of it, here's my mom. She was dying of metastatic cancer, coughing up blood from her lung metastases, and she just moved into the intensive care and lived there for 2 units with the baby, her grandchild, on a ventilator. She's praying to the statue of St. Jude. She's praying to the photo of Padre Pio, the saint. You can pray as a Catholic to saints. You're not worshiping the saint. You're asking the saint to intercede for you, to ask God to help you out. And what the main thing about it was, she held the baby's hand and said, I'm with you, I love you, you're going to be okay. And what she did was she lowered the baby's stress level. So when the baby has to go through all this painful stuff, the baby was on ECMO, endocorporeal membranous oxygen. When the baby has to go through all this stressful stuff, she lowers the baby's stressful. She's the light in the dark. So that, the doctors did a fantastic job keeping this kid alive. But the kid wouldn't have lived if it wasn't for my mom. I mean, we all thought the kid was going to die. So I just show you this. So here it is. So having a purpose and trying to fulfill your purpose in life. And for her purpose was to, try to make things better for her family and friends. She made herself healthier. So this kid ended up fine. Both of those babies, had their problems, and they both ended up doing great. And they both finished college now. One other thing I'll just briefly talk about is, avoiding things that are bad for you. This is my bathroom at my old house. And you'll notice there's nothing in there. I mean, this is some soap that's not even mine. That's the weightlifters used to come into I had a lot of friends who were weightlifters, and they would come to lift weights at my house. And they would sometimes use this like liquid soap, but I didn't never use it. I had a little transparent bar soap. I don't know if you can see it in there. I would put all these pictures around here when I was studying for my neuroradiology boards, which I crushed, as you could guess. But I used to call this the magic bathroom. I've talked about that in other lectures. But the point of this was to show you there's no chemicals. I don't expose myself to any of these chemicals. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the stuff I really wanted to talk about. That was sort of the background. The idea of incrementalism is learn every little thing you can about your area. And for the poor man's approach to cancer is learn all these things. Why getting sun makes a big difference. So make that effort to get your sun. Why exercising makes a difference. So make that effort to get exercise. And we're going to talk a little more about the other things you could do. Why eating the greens all day long gives you better oxygenation of your tissues. And that could potentially help to create a milieu that's going to really favor your regular tissues over cancer. This is the endothelium. Endo means inside, so this is the inside lining of an artery. And it's called the endothelium, and the little part that sticks above it is called the glycocalyx. Glyco means sugar, calyx means husk or coating. So this is the sugar coating of your arteries. And here's the endothelial cells, these little blue cells, and then the glycocalyx is what sticks up above them, and then the blood flow flows past them. Okay, so this would be the phospholipid bilayer of the endothelium. These are I'll show you in another slide this stuff a little bit better. These are the proteins that anchor in the membrane, and then the little side chains coming off them are the sugars. They're also called glycosaminoglycans. GAGs, G-A-G-S, glycosaminoglycans. When there's inflammation or certain other things, they'll destroy the glycocalyx, and that's bad. We'll explain why. Because there's little proteins hidden down at the bottom of the glycocalyx that are often designed for attachment of white blood cells in the context of inflammation. So a normal intact glycocalyx is much taller. They're like tall trees. There's a lady by the name of Vivian Lowe. She's got like VLMD as like her YouTube channel. She's real bright. She made a nice metaphor. It's like moss growing on a rock underneath a stream is what the glycocalyx is like. It's been likened as well to trees growing on the top of a hill. Okay, and that's what it is relative to the endothelium. And I'll show you some more slides. It'll keep making more sense as I show more pictures of it. Here is a red blood cell, and a red blood cell has a negative charge all along its outer surface. This negative charge is called a zeta potential. Here it is, zeta potential. And the zeta potential repels other red blood cells because the other red blood cell has a negative charge. So they both repel each other by their negative charge, which is what you want. You don't want red blood cells to stick together. Okay, now what can stick the red blood cells together? Now, a little typical antibody is small, like an IgG antibody, immune globulin G, because it's too small to stick these guys together. But a big one, an IgM, that's a bigger acute antibody, that one can get in here and connect these two RBCs, make them stick together. So that's why when you have acute infection, there's more of a tendency towards clotting in that area. This word zeta potential is going to be real important. It's going to keep coming up. Okay, here's the endothelial glycocalyx. So here's the endothelial cell. Endo meaning inside. It's the lining cells of your arteries. And then the glycocalyx is the little proteins that stick above. So here's one of the proteins. Here's a typical proteoglycan. So proteo means protein. Glycan means sugar. So a proteoglycan means that it's mostly sugar. Glycoprotein, by the way, is sort of the opposite. It's really the category. Glyco means sugar, protein means protein. When you hear the word glycoprotein, what it means is that it's mostly protein. When you hear the word proteoglycan, what that means is that it's mostly sugar. A proteoglycan is actually a subset, really, in a sense, of glycoproteins, okay? The thing up here is SOD. This is extracellular EC superoxide dismutase. So that's just an enzyme that attaches to the glycocalyx, and it helps prevent, it blocks reactive oxygen species, meaning oxidative stress. The endothelial glycocalyx, so this whole thing is called the glycocalyx. So endothelium is the endothelial cells lining an artery. Glyco is sugar. Calyx is coating. So it's the sugar coating that lines the arteries. It's called sugar coating because there's a lot of these little side chain gags. There it says GAG, glycosaminoglycans, which are just disaccharides, repeating disaccharides, sugar units. All right, and they're going to have a negative charge on them. So the endothelial glycocalyx comes together from multiple different areas. Part of it is made by the endothelial cell. Okay, it has to synthesize these things in the endoplasmic reticulum, ship them off to the Golgi apparatus to package them and get them ready to secrete out and attach to their plasma membrane. Other proteins will come to it from that were made in the liver. Other components come from the bone marrow. And what I'm trying to say is this complexity is so amazing. All these things make me believe in God. Okay, I know as much biochemistry, molecular biology, health, medicine as anyone in the whole world. And I will tell you that the more you know it, the more you believe in God. And think about it. If you get some genius person, all right, and they devote their entire life to studying biology, okay, or health, or this sort of stuff, molecular biology, at the end of their life, after devoting their entire career, 60 years, they will have discovered one thing if they're a great scientist, one significant thing, and maybe they win a Nobel Prize for it. So what I'm trying to say is that's one out of a million things there are to know that an entire genius-level human life can only discover one thing. So don't kid yourself. If you were walking down the beach and you saw your name written in the sand, you would look at your name, and as soon as you saw your name written in the sand, you would say, my goodness, an intelligent, literate person must have been here that wrote my name in the sand who's trying to communicate with me. You wouldn't say the ocean wrote your name in the sand. No, that wouldn't happen. All right? It would be, you knew it was an intelligent person who did that, who's literate, who could read, and who knows how to write. And so what I'm trying to say is the human DNA genome is 3.3 billion, B as in billion, base pairs. And it's much more complicated than writing your name in the sand. Okay, do you think that spontaneously happened? Okay, I majored in evolutionary biology, was an A+ student in the subject, and I've read over 50 books since I graduated on the subject, so I'm familiar with the information. The people who really know it, the ones that are honest, they believe in God because no one can explain it. It's so amazing, it's beyond. All these things coming together, like in the human eye, the immune system, the clotting system. Okay, so we won't go into that too much more, but I'm just giving you a sense of it. We're going to come back to all this stuff. So this is an important thing. This glycocalyx creates a slippery surface and that the red blood cells travel right next to it. Okay, and they need that surface. And it prevents clotting. Here's the glycocalyx in more detail. The syndicans are these big proteins. These are called core proteins. They're anchored in the plasma membrane of the endothelial cell. So the syndican goes all the way back to the cytoplasm. The other main protein of core protein is going to be these glycans, and they're anchored into the membrane, but they themselves, the protein itself, component of it does not traverse the entire membrane like some of these other ones do. Okay, here's the glycoproteins. These are the smaller ones with less sugars on them. These typical core proteins like the syndicans, they got these big, long sugars. You see how it's repeating units of a disaccharide? So this is called heparin sulfate. So the heparin is negatively charged. The sulfate's got lots of sulfates on it. They're all negatively charged. And later on, we're going to talk about how cholesterol sulfate is related to this as well. But just know that heparin sulfate is the most important of the negatively charged glycosaminoglycans, sugars on your endothelial glycocalyx. So the bottom line is all these negative charges from the heparin sulfate, they create a negative charge barrier. So when a red cell comes right here, comes towards it, it'll bounce away, if you will, because of the negative charge. Also because it's lubricated. They attract water to themselves, and that water attracts to themselves and makes them slippery. Water actually has 4 phases. Everybody knows liquid, gas, solid, ice, but there's actually a 4th phase of water. Gerald Pollack is the main guy who figured this out, where it's like jello. And we're going to come to that in just a moment. So you want an intact glycocalyx because it protects your arteries. It protects them from thrombosis. It protects them from cancer invasion. So that was really the key point here. An intact glycocalyx prevents cancer from invading your arteries. You can't, the metastatic cell can't get into the organ system, the tissue, unless it can get past this glycocalyx. And a good, healthy glycocalyx prevents that. When the glycocalyx is trashed, here it is damaged by inflammation. Inflammation will damage it. Inflammation causes the release of these enzymes which cleave the glycoproteins, cleave the sugars. This is MMPs, are metalloproteinases. Hyaluronidase will cleave these. Hyaluronidase help to cross-link the glycocalyx. This is another one of these glycosaminoglycans. Okay, so we'll keep going. I'll keep showing you more details about how it all works. We'll sort of build up the subject. Okay, so again, here's the phospholipid bilayer, the plasma membrane. Here's the red blood cells passing by. What this shear stress mechanotransduction stuff is about is they will deflect the proteoglycans, and as they tip them in the normal expected direction, the part that's anchored inside the cytoplasm will move, and that'll cause nitric oxide to be synthesized. It'll activate enos. Enos is endothelial nitric oxide. Okay, so again, you see all these heparin sulfates preventing clotting. Okay, that's a big thing. They do a lot more than that, but preventing clotting is a real important thing they do for our person. And also the negative charges they make create a zeta potential that repels the RBCs. Okay, another way to think of it, now let's imagine these are above and that we're sort of flowing in the artery back through here. They got a really big negative charge. All right. In addition, they're shaped kind of like a bottle brush. You know, you use a bottle brush to clean. Oops, shit! I don't want to move that. You use a bottle brush to clear out a test tube. Oh, I can't do it. Whatever. I'll stop doing that for this one. So remember that they look like bottle brushes. Okay. That'll be useful to you. As a matter of fact, when I think of it, I think of them as being a little bit like your red blood cell when it flows through here. It's like these brushes. It reminds me of a car wash. They're kind of all those brushes that when you go through it and you sit inside your car. That's what they're like. Okay, so here's a red blood cell traveling through a capillary. Typically an RBC is about 7 microns. Capillary is about 5 microns in diameter. So it's bigger, and it actually has to deform itself a little bit to get through there. But for the sake of illustration, they're showing the red blood cell here. It has a typical discoid shape. And when it passes through, it actually compresses. Normally when there's no red cell or WBC inside the lining of the artery. Here's the lining of the artery. The glycocalyx projects into it. These are some slides of glycocalyces. Here's the glycocalyces, again, looking like a bunch of plants sticking up from the side of a hill. And this is actually kind of a cool one, whereby it's a little bit confusing, but here's a white blood cell inside a capillary, and it's smushing down the glycocalyx. Okay, when it smushes down the glycocalyx, there's a red blood cell traveling through the capillary. Here, there's nothing in the capillary. See, the glycocalyx pushes back in towards the center of the lumen of the capillary versus when it's got a WBC. WBCs tend to be bigger than RBCs, usually think of them as being twice the size of an RBC. Let's say RBC is 7 microns. Typical leukocyte, let's say, is 14 microns, like a neutrophil, for example. By the way, over about 99.9% of cells in your blood are red blood cells. That's most of your cells, okay? White blood cells are relatively uncommon in comparison. All right, so anyways, when the WBC travels through the capillary, it smushes the glycocalyx up against the walls of the endothelium. And then once it's passed, the glycocalyx springs back into position. And that clever lady, Vivian Lowe, she said, it's like a bumper car. You know, when the bumper car hits the side of the arena for the bumper cars, it sort of bounces off. And that's what it's like because of the charge. White blood cells also have a charge on them, a negative charge, a zeta potential, and they bounce off the glycocalyx. And that also helps to propel them down the capillary. So it's pretty cool how it all works. All right, this guy, his name is Andre K, and he runs a YouTube channel where he teaches biochemistry. And I think he had a great lecture. He's got a lot of good lectures. I learned a lot from this guy over the years. But he had a really nice lecture on glycosaminoglycan. So the vertical purple stripe here is the protein of the proteoglycan, and the reds are, let's say, heparin sulfates. These might be chondroitin sulfates or something, the brown side chains. Anyways, they create a negative charge around themselves, a zeta potential, but they actually attract water. The reason they attract water is, look at water. Water is like my fingers here. It's like a dipole. The two hydrogens have a partial positive charge, and let's say this is the oxygen here of the water dipole, H2O, and the positive charge will interact with the negative charge of the glycosaminoglycans. And so the water will have this non-covalent attachment to the glycosaminoglycans. And then when there's pressure, the water will kind of bounce off transiently, and then once the pressure is alleviated, the water will come back to it. And you'll say, this is fantastically brilliant. You know, this is the mind of God to figure this all out. Because what happens here is, think about it. In your arteries, it's like the bumper car bumper to help the red blood cells speed along. And it's also a lubricant, the water on there, that the RBCs can flow through this capillary that's smaller than their diameter. But this, think about it, this makes sense in your joint. When you're walking, when your foot hits, there's impact, let's say in your knee joint. And the cartilage will have tons of these, like chondroitin sulfate. What do you think people talk about all the time? Chondroitin sulfate. It has the water attached to it, and the water will kind of bounce off transiently during the impact moment. And then, as soon as that's over, the water immediately rushes back to it. And this is how your body tolerates all the impacts all day long of walking and running. And it's brilliant. It works. It's amazing. That's how it works. Okay, so this idea of intact glycosaminoglycans, which need tons of sulfate, we're going to come back to sulfate in just a moment, helps to prevent arthritis throughout your entire body. So yeah, if you want to understand glycosaminoglycans, watch his lecture. It's great. I watched a whole bunch of lectures on the subject. His is the best one. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about water. What is water all about? So we know that water used to be thought to have three phases. Ice is a solid, water is a liquid, so to speak, and vapor is the gas phase. But actually, there's a structured phase of water where it's like a crystal. And, you know, obviously ice is a crystal too, but it's a soft crystal like Jell-O. And that is a gel phase of water. And actually, most of the water in the human body, and water is the most common molecule in the human body, it's in the gel phase. The extracellular matrix is gel phase water. The endothelial glycocalyx is gel phase water. The intracellular cytoplasm fluid is in a gel phase. Okay, so this is actually super important. And some of the reasons why it's so important is the gel phase of water, because it's like a crystal and crystals tend to exclude other types of molecules, it creates largely an exclusion zone that it's not easy for anything to get through that water where it's in crystal phase. And it also creates a negative charge around itself. So the positive charge is separate from it, and that helps. That's part of what generates the negatively charged zeta potential of the endothelial glycocalyx. Number one, it's gel phase water attracted to those glycosaminoglycans. Number two, the negative charges of the heparin sulfate and the other glycosaminoglycan sugars like the chondroitin sulfate. And then the next thing is, because there's cholesterol sulfates also associated with it. Okay, so sulfur is SO4 2- negative charge, and it creates a major powerful negative charge in this system. This is just showing a little bit more about, they call it easy water for exclusion water. There's also gel water, structured water, and that's as opposed to bulk water, which would be like the plasma flowing in the blood. So bulk water is your typical liquid water. You know, if you fill up a cup of water, that's bulk water. But if you make some Jell-O, where it's in a gel solid form, that is easy water, exclusion zone water, or structured water, it's also called, or the fourth phase of water. And this shows the crystalline mechanism of it, with the reds being oxygens and the blues being hydrogen. So again, there's a partial positive charge on the red, partial positive charge on the blue here, and there's a partial negative charge on the red, and that's how water is polar and has a dipole. And other aspects of this can interact, you know, be attracted to the glycosaminoglycans. All right. And this idea of having a negatively charged gel that excludes positive charges creates a charge separation. It's a little bit like a battery. So the body produces energy, and this is going to make sense. Again, we're not going to go into all this right now, but what I'm trying to do is build up the argument for why getting your sunshine is so important and maintaining sulfur levels, because it's part of the energy system of the human body. And getting your sunshine is a way that the body, there's more ways. You can get sulfur from your diet, but you also get it from being in the sun. That adds to it. So sunshine does a lot of good things for you, and that's why I don't think it's a smart idea to think you're just going to get your vitamin D from a pill when you're missing out on the other benefits of sunshine if you don't get some. So this is just showing a red blood cell in a cross section going through a capillary. You got the negative charge around the red blood cell, and these are cholesterol sulfates, by the way, which are bound to the glycocalyx. The yellow is the sulfur, and then the red are the 4 oxygens around, and it'll have a negative charge, negative 2 charge. And this is called exclusion zone or structured water, meaning that the water in the gel of the glycocalyx, and these are endothelial cells, is in a gel form. and it has a negative charge. It repels the RBC, and because it repels the RBC sort of bounces off it like a bumper car bumping off the bumpers. And if you feel it, it's lubricated and smooth, kind of like moss growing on a rock. And again, that's the analogy, the metaphor by Vivian Lowe, MD. That's her name, VLMD, I think is her YouTube channel. She's very bright, and those are really good metaphors she came up. She's a real smart doctor lady. Okay, so anyways, what I'm trying to show you this is how beautiful this all is. I mean, how clever is the human body, you know, and the design of it. That all the red blood cells have negative charges so they don't stick together. The white blood cells have negative charges so they don't stick together. The endothelium has a coating with a negative charge on it so nothing sticks together when it's not supposed to. It's magnificent. This is beautiful. This is an AO, an academic orgasm. This is so beautiful. Okay, and by the way, when I was in med school, that was my attitude, that to learn biochemistry and molecular biology was to learn the language that God uses to write the book of life. And, you know, having that attitude, I think that's a giant part of why I was such a great student, was because I considered myself, how lucky am I to get to learn how God created life? And when you think that way, you're more enthusiastic and motivated. If you're saying to yourself, oh, this is just a pain in the butt, I can't wait till I get a real job and make money, I'm just going to try to pass this test, well, then you're only going to do what you need to do to get by. But when you see it as beautiful and you're on a wonderful opportunity to be able to study this stuff, then you remember it better, you learn it better. Okay, so here's cholesterol sulfate. First of all, here's cholesterol. Cholesterol itself, you know, it's got the 4 cyclic rings. It's actually quite hydrophobic. The only mildly polar thing on it is this oxygen is bound to a hydroxyl group. So cholesterol by itself is very hydrophobic, meaning that it is it's not soluble in water. But when you stick a sulfate on it, sulfate has a -2 charge. Now it becomes soluble in water, and it becomes something called amphiphilic. Amphi means like amphibian, like a frog can live on water and can live on land. Philic means to love. So amphiphilic makes it water soluble. And this enables this to float in the blood. Our blood is like water. So in order to transport anything in the blood, it has to be like dissolved in water. So all the steroid hormones have a cholesterol backbone, this 4-ring structure. And basically, they're all hydrophobic, and you can't ship them in the blood. But if you attach sulfate to them, you can now ship them in the blood because you've made them polar. Now they can float and be dissolved in aqueous solution. So in a sense, they're both helping each other. The sulfate on the steroid hormone makes it water soluble, so the steroid hormone can be delivered to its target. The steroid on the sulfate prevents the sulfate from generating easy water or structured water. If you had a bunch of sulfates in the blood, they would cause it to form a gel and be structured and clot. You don't want that. So when the sulfates are attached to something and the functioning like a zeta potential, like in the glycocalyx, they do a good job. You want that negative charge there. But you don't want a whole bunch of sulfur not bound to anything else in your blood forming sulfates, because they'll cause the blood to gel and clot. Okay, so this idea of helping each other is a wonderful thing, because what it means is the steroid hormones, and this means testosterone, estrogen, and a whole bunch of other ones, get delivered safely, but the sulfate is simultaneously being delivered to the target tissue. Okay, that's going to come up a lot later, so just be aware of that. The red blood cells have cholesterol sulfates that help them generate their zeta potential. The zeta potential is also, of course, generated by sialic acids on their outer surface, but it's also generated by cholesterol sulfates, and they will deliver cholesterol sulfate to the tissue as they go through the capillary. So in a sense, red blood cells are exporting cholesterol sulfate to the capillary wall, and they're supplying it with the cholesterol, the sulfate, and the negative charge. So that's how it gets transported around, the cholesterol and the cholesterol sulfate. That's another way that it does. All right, now what are some things that damage the glycocalyx, the endothelial coating? One of them is if you eat a high-fat meal, you got a lot of LDL cholesterol. Those are bridging molecules. They stick the red blood cells together because the LDL cholesterols have a positive charge in them, and they're big enough to stick the RBCs together. When you're trying to push this almost like a multi-decker sandwich of LDL and red blood cells through a capillary, pressure has to go up to pump thick fluid. The blood is thicker. It's higher in viscosity. So when blood pressure goes up, it's going to come to bifurcations. Normally you want blood flow. It'd be like your hand. What I mean by your hand is in the middle is where the red blood cells are. Then just adjacent to them is where the WBCs are. And adjacent to that is where the plasma is. So normally the plasma is up against the glycocalyx in the wall of the artery, the endothelium. RBCs are in the center. WBCs are here. But of course there's tons more RBCs than there are anything else. Okay. And the flow is fastest in the center, so it's a parabolic velocity profile. And that's called laminar flow. You need to know that laminar flow is normal. What happens is, let's say this is the common carotid artery. It goes up into the internal carotid artery, external carotid artery. It hits a median divider. This bifurcation stuff in the middle, this median divider, it'll bounce off that and become turbulent, and then there'll be these retrograde eddy currents. Not good. These retrograde eddy currents disrupt the normal mechanical transduction of the endothelial glycocalyx. What that means is, when the lining of the artery senses that the flow is abnormal, too much turbulence or too much retrograde flow, it gets confused. It thinks the artery is injured, and it starts to shed off its glycocalyx, the good zeta potential component, and then now the binding proteins like ICAM, intracellular cell adhesion molecule, VCAM, vascular cell adhesion molecule, become expressed. They're shorter. I'll show you pictures of them. They're hiding down at the bottom of that glycocalyx, and they will then cause red blood cells to adhere, WBCs to adhere, and you'll form clots. And you end up in this constant steady state of forming clots and clearing them off. The body has ways to clear them off, but eventually as the person gets older, they stop being able to adequately clear them, and they start stroking when this is going up to the brain and the carotid system, or if it's in the heart, they'll start embolizing distally and thrombosing arteries and knocking off heart tissue, having heart attacks, myocardial infarctions. So this is an important point I wanted to make. Hypertension does this. This is why hypertension is bad. It causes atherosclerosis because every time it hits a branch point, it generates turbulent flow and retrograde eddy flow. So here's flow coming up, hits the median divider, and then it spirals back, and it'll have thrombosis along the wall, and it'll form a clot. Okay, here it is forming a clot right here. And it does that again because when it comes in as hypertension, it'll bounce off the median divider. It'll become quite turbulent. Turbulent means in all different directions. It also means audible flow. You can hear it when you listen to it. And then there's retrograde eddy currents, and they confuse the endothelial cells, which are spindle-shaped and lined up along the long axis of the normal direction of flow. And they will then shed their glycocalyx because they think there's an injury, and they'll just their thrombotic molecules attached to the surface are exposed. This is just showing after a high-fat meal, saturated fat, omega-6 fats, etc. They cause prolonged thickening of the blood. And if you take a bunch of patients with coronary artery angina, they'll get chest pain during that moment. They'll measure their blood lipids every 30 minutes. So eating high fat is bad for blood flow. Okay, don't let anybody tell you otherwise. All right, this is just showing the work, the research of Roy Swank. And Dr. McDougall shows the Roy Swank video on his YouTube channel. And here it is. You can go to drmcdougall.health. You can see this video. It's a great video. Everybody should see this at least once in their life. You remember this the rest of your life. And it's been repeated, this research in the eyes, when they look with microscopes, underneath the tongue, sublingual. So it's pretty well-known stuff. There's a guy by the name of Dr. Brinkat. He's got videos of this sort of stuff too. I actually know a doctor who's currently doing research on this subject, and I've seen his videos. They're amazing. You can see the red blood cells floating around in there. Meyer Friedman and Ray Rosenman wrote papers on this. Peter Kuo had written some of the original papers on it. And the oils, the omega-6 fats, because they try to replace the saturated fat, which Ansel Keys figured out in the 1950s was, atherogenic. They tried to replace that with all these cooking oils like safflower oil, corn oil, etc. And those were shown to be even worse than the saturated fat. Okay, briefly on sodium. You need to have sodium gradients, electrochemical gradients. They're used for energy in every single cell in your body. And the point of it is we are designed to eat tons of potassium and hardly any sodium. And our entire energy system of our plasma membrane runs on that. So when somebody eats high dietary sodium, they're messing up their energy system. You want to be eating, I would say 10 times as much, at a minimum 5 times as much potassium. But if you're eating a lot of meat and processed food, your sodium is going to be higher than your dietary intake of potassium. And that's going to really damage your plasma membrane energy system. So what do I mean by energy system? Well, by the way, it's called the K factor. So you want a K factor, meaning potassium greater than sodium by at least 5 to 1. Again, I would say at least 10 to 1. I think our ancestors probably ate about 25 to 1. All right, and the reason for that is, and the reason I'm showing you all this is elevated intake of salt, sodium chloride, increases cancer risk, okay? And it also decreases it causes more hypertension, it makes your body more fatigable. And here's one of the problems about it is that your entire energy system for all these plasma membrane pumps in your cell. So here's intracellular inside the cell, here's extracellular out here. It's all based on the electrical gradient. Negative 65 millivolts is a typical membrane energy potential. And again, this is like a battery, having positive charge on one side, negative charge on the other side. And if you eat too much dietary sodium, it dissipates this gradient, and you'll end up with increased intracellular calcium. We're not going to go into all the biochemistry of this. I've given previous several lectures on salt, but I'm trying to show you this is things you can do. So what have we talked about? Get your sunshine. Get lots of exercise. Eat greens multiple times during the day. The exercise gets all your lymphatic flow. Besides activating the AMP-PK pathway to put your body away from mTOR, it also gets your lymphatic flow going throughout your body 30-fold increased, so that way your immune system surveils your entire body and protects you from cancer. And so not eating a lot of sodium, but eating a lot of potassium. Potassium comes from plants. P for plants, P for potassium. You crank up the good stuff and you minimize the bad stuff, so your cells will have optimal energy to do all the jobs they need to do and to prevent cancer. Your immune system cells will have this as well. And then just briefly, I had a whole bunch of lectures on iron, but iron comes mostly from meat in the form of heme iron, and we absorb heme iron much higher than we do any type of iron from a plant, which is not in the center of a heme molecule. Men get overloaded in iron as soon as they're done growing in their 20s in a Western country where they're eating meat or iron-fortified foods like cereals and grains. Women tend to become iron overloaded as soon as they're stopped menstruating. The iron's bad because once you get iron overloaded, you have iron becoming free, where it'll catalyze the Fenton reaction. Fe for iron ferrous, that's the Latin word for iron. Fe for Fenton reaction, and that'll lead to the production of hydroxyl radicals, which then trash cell membranes, either in the mitochondria or plasma membranes. That's called lipid peroxidation. So iron overload is a bad thing. Here's the Fenton reaction showing that you get iron that's free. When I say free, I mean not bound to anything, which happens once you're overloaded. It starts to become free. Earlier than that, it's just where it needs to be. It'll cycle back and forth between Fe3 plus and Fe2 plus. Fe3 plus, Fe2 plus. That's called ferrous as an iron redox, like redox reaction, reduction, oxidation reaction, cycling. And it'll activate this Fenton reaction, Fe Fenton reaction, to produce hydroxyl radicals. So becoming iron overloaded generates lots of oxidative stress. Oxidative stress just means oxidation reactions are higher than your antioxidant capacities. So once you have an excess of oxidants, they just damage tissue. They'll damage membrane lipids, they'll damage DNA, they'll damage whatever they bump into. One last thing here. This is an amino acid. So an amino acid has an alpha carbon in the center. It's called an amino because it has an amino group on there, NH2. It's called an acid because it has a carboxylic group attached to it. Again, the alpha carbon is right in the center. And then there's a hydrogen attached to it. To me, this looks like a cross. There's the H for the head, and the R is the side chain going down. And this is variable, okay? What we want to watch out for is the ones that have sulfur on them. So here's just a way I used to remember all the amino acids. But the point is this sulfur-containing amino acid right here is methionine. I put the sulfur in the center right there. There's also cysteine right here. And cysteine has like a thiol group right there where there's a sulfur on it. And the point is there's a lot more methionine and cysteine in meat. And the sulfur, part of their metabolic pathways is that they get degraded as sulfuric acid and they cause acidosis, a metabolic acidosis that's caused by animal protein. And the buffering process, well, first of all, the acidosis favors the cancerous milieu. Animal protein contains a lot more leucine. I don't know if I got leucine in here somewhere. I haven't looked at this in a while. The leucine is what's the main rate-limiting stuff. Here's leucine, and that will activate mTOR. Okay, so you don't want that. Methionine is also needed for cell replication. It's an essential amino acid that's relatively deficient in plants, which is what you want. This is just one picture of an advanced glycation end product. So here's a sugar molecule of glucose. It'll just bind to the side chain of protein. That's called glycation, advanced glycation end products. Like hemoglobin A1C is glycated hemoglobin. And you get that when you have hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia also destroys the glycocalyx. So what am I basically saying? What was the point of this whole talk? In addition to eating a low-fat, low-sodium, 100% plant-based diet, avoiding your iron, getting your exercise, getting your sunshine, eating greens all through the day, all these things will maximize oxygenation of your tissues, which favors normal, healthy tissues over the cancer. And these are things that anybody can do. It's been called God's way of healing because anyone could do this, could just eat healthy and cheap, all right? Anyone could exercise. Anyone could do all these things with their family, their stress reduction, their religion and whatnot to optimize their stress management and their health. So there's a lot of things that anyone could do to lower the risk of ever getting cancer and increase their chance of surviving longer if they do have cancer. So That's why I showed this to you. I hope it was helpful.